Okay, go.
Steve, thank you very much for asking me to speak this afternoon. I thought it appropriate, as you've already said, I have a particular interest in tartans of the 18th century, the period of the 45, right up to the early industrialisation of tartan through the early to mid 19th century. But I thought today I'd look at it, a particular tartan with a strong link to the 45 and subsequently. So what we would now call the Murray of Tullibardine. And it is a tartan with, as the title suggests, an unbroken link to the 45. I haven't timed this talk, but I'll run through it. Very happy to take questions afterwards about this and or any other areas of my work. So many of you, I guess, will be familiar with the Murray of Tullibardine tartan. It's one of those that is, certainly we can date to the mid-18th century. It's interesting because it is unlike an awful lot of other tartans of the period. Someone's still got their mic live, and I don't know who it is. But what's interesting about it, most tartans are what we call, have a sort of counterbalance. So you have, if you like, a red area or a blue area and a corresponding green area. Murray of Tullibardine is a pattern which is ostensibly has a red ground and then just a whole load of other stripes over the top of it. Generally blue, green and black stripes, but if I just were to change those just all into one color, you can see just how busy it is and exactly what I mean by it having one solid color, if I've reversed these around, and then just all the other stripes overlying it. So I say it's quite unusual in its structure compared with what one might think of as traditional tartans, which are much more what we describe as counterbalanced. So here, on the left here, we've got another 18th century tartan, the MacDonald of Keppoch, and it has classically, and I hope you can see my mouse, but you've got a green square and a red square. Compare that to the Murray of Tullibardine. As I say, you don't have that, what we would call a counterbalanced pattern. So it's ostensibly a much, much busier pattern. As I say, it's a pattern that we can trace back to the 18th century and which has a continuum of use from the middle of the 18th century right up to today. And you'll see it offered commercially. There's an example, you'll see it in a wide variety of color shades or palettes. This is House of Edgar's muted shades, what we would call modern colors, which actually are closer to some of the older pieces, old colors or vegetable dye colors, which are nothing like old or vegetable dye colors, and weathered or reproduction colors, which are supposed to represent 18th century patterns, and again, they don't. I simply put these up there to show how the same pattern can look quite different depending on the shades employed. So those are all the same colors. It's just, you know, there is no standard shade of red, blue or green. And what most of the commercial weavers now do generically is that whether it is in modern colors, so that's these, old colors, weathered colors, the palette is the same, if you like, it is uniform. So all the colors are relatively dark, they're relatively muted, they're relatively light. It doesn't change the actual pattern. So the underlying pattern is this complex or 18th century pattern. So as I say, offered today in a variety of color palettes, but what do we know of its history? As I say, there's the pattern you'll be familiar with, those that know the pattern. So we can go here. So the earliest written record we have of it is in James Grant's book, The Clans and Tartans of Scotland, where you can see he says of it, it's called the Tullibardine, there's a red tartan, was adopted by Charles, 1st Earl of Dunmore, second son of the Marquis of Tullibardine, and that he wore it in, well, by inference, he wore it in 1679 as the Colonel of the Royal Greys Dragoons, latterly the Royal Scots Greys, etc. A little confusing because there's a, as I say, there's an inference that the tartan that he is said to have worn, he wore when he was the Colonel of the Royal Scots Greys. Actually, Grant, his book was about the fourth or fifth in a series of tartan books published from the middle of the 19th century. He seems to have got most of his information from the Smiths of Mauchline brothers. They published a book in 1850, and they're known to be the source of much of Grant's subsequent works, and they wrote of this pattern. We can say we found this very pretty pattern in the market. We can say nothing more about it other than that the proprietors of a respectable tartan warehouse from which we obtained it assured us that it was the tartan used by the Earl of Dunmore. So they don't say when. So by the time, we're only 30 years later, Grant is writing and he's decided which Earl of Dunmore it was they were writing about, whereas the Smiths writing in 1850 could have been talking about the current Earl of Dunmore, and I will show you evidence later on that indeed he or his family were wearing it at the time. The respectable tartan warehouse mentioned by the Smiths was in all probability Wilsons of Bannockburn, because they were the great tartan weavers of the time. So you'll all be familiar with Lord George Murray. I cannot prove that he is wearing the Tullibardine tartan here, but the overall arrangement of that tartan, so it's let's call it in the kilt here, a red tartan with a series of overstripes, and it's not exactly clear, but it could be intended to be and represent the Tullibardine tartan. It could have been something completely different, of course. We don't know. Unknown artist, it could have possibly been William Mossman or Cosmo Alexander, those artists who were busy doing Jacobite portraits during the periods of 1740 through to about 1760. I put this up there particularly not only because it has a similarity to the pattern that we're talking about, and I say it could be, but because of this one, again, which you will all be familiar with, the unknown Jacobite lady wearing a tartan. I've done quite a lot of work on this portrait. This is by Cosmo Alexander, as many of you are possibly familiar with. And here you can see the arrangements of in this case, the weft, or warp turned sideways, of the Murray of Tullibardine tartan. And you can see it is an exact match to the pattern of the coat. I mean, this coat has been, or the painting, has been done in incredibly detailed representation of the tartan. So well is it done that it is you can almost take a thread count of it. It's a perfect match to the Murray of Tullibardine tartan. So demonstrably the Tullibardine tartan here that she's wearing it, but who was she? We can't be certain because it's not titled, so we can't know for certain who the sitter was, nor indeed whether she was a Murray. But there are several possible contenders amongst the strongly Jacobite Murray clan. There is, or was, Lady Mary Murray, the daughter of the first Duke of Athol, Lady Jane Murray, daughter of the second Duke of Athol, Lady Charlotte Murray, daughter of the second Duke of Athol, so another daughter, Amelia Murray, Lord George Murray's wife, so back to Lord George Murray, Lady Amelia Murray, possibly, or Amelia Murray, Lord George's daughter. I had a long discussion on Arch UK about this and the possible age of the sitter, and there was a general consensus amongst artists that she was anything from about 14 to about 18. So if this is in any way accurate, and she was one of those people whom I mentioned, and there are other people who have been discussed, it is more likely that it's a depiction of Amelia, daughter of Lord George Murray. As I say, we can't be certain, but what we can say is this is definitely the Tullibardine tartan, and therefore we can definitely anchor that tartan to the period of the 45, without a shadow of a doubt. So these specimens are, so there are three specimens of the Tullibardine tartan. These are from, I found them in a chest of drawers in the attic at Blair Castle many years ago. You've got a strip that shows the full width of the cloth along here, and then you've got two sections which clearly have been cut out of probably a piece of clothing, possibly subsequently used for furnishings or something like that. It is very hard. It only has three colours, red, blue and green, so there is no black as we get it in the normal pattern. It's my conjecture that this is possibly the proto version or the early version of the Murray of Tullibardine Tartan. The only way to be really sure would be to test the yarn to do a dye analysis, which would probably tell us whether there were any imported dyes, including imported hardwood dyes, which would help date it. But as I say, it's interesting. As I said, red, blue and green with no black lines, which you will see later. I've already talked about the complex setting, so when you look at this, you can't relate it to any other particular tartan. But it wasn't just Jacobites that were associated with this tartan. It seems to have been, if you like, the default tartan for artists to show Highland references. Is that tartan without the black. So it's the Murray of Tullibardine tartan. Normally, these dark lines in here, which are green in this one, are black in later versions of the Murray of Tullibardine. Bear in mind that setting for something I will show you subsequently. Oh, there is the pattern overlaid. Yep. So those show you where those pieces sit within the overall arrangement of the pattern. So you can see how it fits in and what the whole thing would have looked like, whatever it was originally, a length of cloth or whatever. I mentioned other artists. Allan Ramsay, it was his go-to tartan. And we have a number of portraits, 3 in fact, by him that show this tartan. We have John Campbell, 4th Earl of Loudon. Why is he wearing it? Well, he's probably wearing it because he wanted to be painted in tartan. This is painted probably in 1747. He at the time, of course, was commanding Loudon's Highlanders, Hanoverian force. Lots of discussion. He's said to have been painted in his regimentals, which probably was a reference to his coat, because this plaid, which is Murray of Tullibardine, was never used regimentally and never used by the Hanoverian military. But to say, an Allan Ramsay portrait. Another Hanoverian, Norman MacLeod, 22nd Chief, Member of Parliament for Inverness, painted, and again, not easy to see, but if you just look at this in detail, that is the same tartan. And then finally, and perhaps everybody's favourite, Flora MacDonald. I think this one's weight, isn't it? If I remember rightly. So this is in the Ashmolean, one portrait, I think the only one I've never seen of all of these. But again, she is wearing it, all painted by Allan Ramsay. He was quite interesting. He was known for doing particularly hands and faces. That was his speciality. He would do the composition, but he then subcontracted a lot of the furniture and the clothing to another artist, an artist called Joseph Van Aken. Van Aken died in July 1749, so all of these must have been done before then, if he indeed did the tartan. So it's likely that the artist, be that Ramsay or Aitken, had a piece of the Tullibardine tartan, which was in his studio, which was their go-to tartan when they wanted to add, if you like, the Scottish or the Highland effect to their portraits. And it's just very interesting that it didn't matter whether you were a Jacobite or a Hanoverian. If you wanted to be shown in tartan, this was the default pattern. And what's really interesting is it's a very complex pattern for an artist to depict and render correctly. And if you see the original, any of these original portraits, again, they're painted so meticulously that you could almost take a thread count of any one of these. So really, really interesting. And then finally, we have, slightly later, and back to a Murray connection, we have the 4th Earl of Dunmore. So said to be 1760 to 1770, so painted in 1770, but aspects of the costumes, of the cut of the coat, etc., is more like 1760, so it could be a retrospective. But what's interesting is that the jacket and waistcoat again here are absolutely Murray of Tullibardine. You can hold a piece of cloth up to it. There we are. Again, the Murray of Tullibardine tartan, and you can see how all the stripes align. So again, different artists. We're now on to a third artist who must have had access to a piece of this tartan in order to render it in such detail. And what I find amazing is that they chose, or it was dictated to them, that they would use this tartan, which, as I said earlier, is a really complex pattern. They could have used any other number of tartans which existed at the time, which would have been far easier to paint. But for whatever reason, they chose to paint this far more complex tartan. So that takes us through paintings right through to the period of about 1770, so right through the period of Jacobitism, including the period of prescription, which of course forbade the wearing of Highland clothes by males, less the gentry. The gentry were actually exempt. It didn't ban tartan per se, which explains how, for example, Norman MacLeod, John Campbell, and indeed the Earl of Dunmore can have been painted during prescription when theoretically they weren't allowed to be wearing tartan. We then have a slight gap in our, if you like, our touch point to this tartan until the early 19th century and the work of Wilsons of Bannockburn. It's interesting that this tartan was not amongst those certified by the chief and included in the Highland Society of London's collection, completed between 1816 to 22. The normal or standard Murray of Atholl was included, but this one wasn't. So it was not regarded as, if you like, as the clan tartan at the time. So that's quite interesting. These are all Wilsons of Bannockburn pieces, again, contemporary with the period. So again, those of you who've been to Blair will know this bed. The bed curtains or canopy are Murray of Tullibardine, very similar to those offcuts I showed you, but not quite the same. This is said to be, although the curtains are said to be from the Tullibardine bed, which came from Tullibardine, that supposedly slept, I think it was 12 people or something like that, it was so large, that was then taken up to Blair and used. I suspect that these curtains and this tartan may have been a copy of the ones that were allegedly on the bed that slept 12 people. This is not that bed. I think this set of curtains is probably about 1800 or something like that. As I say, for a long time, the oldest known piece was, known piece in existence was this piece here on the hangings. They're made from a single width of cloth. It's approximately 28, it would have been 28 yards long by about 27 inches wide. As I said, the bed's not the original, which was a huge one, moved to Blair in 1829. So these hangings are probably a copy of around that period, but it's not known whether the originals were still on the bed when it was moved, or as I say, whether these were made as a subsequent copy. And it's interesting that it is woven. So this is a joined piece of cloth. I've got a picture of it. Yeah, there's a picture of it there. You can see the join runs down the middle there. It's what we call an offset pattern. So a pivot is here, there, runs across, and on the edge here we have a herringbone selvage, which suggests that this was a copy of an older plaid. This herringboning technique was something that you saw, or did you see, in a lot of 18th century specimens, but you don't see later in the 19th century unless they are copying an older piece. It's a technique that completely disappeared. As I say, it's woven offset, and the colouring is so dark that it gives a sort of blue, black, and red appearance. These darker squares in here are in fact green. So there we go, that's that. Here's another piece of Wilson's cloth. So this is a copy probably of about 1830 of these older curtains. Again, a piece at Blair Castle. They have an awful lot of original specimens just lying around covering desks and drawers and chairs and things like that. So next time you're up there, have a look at the individual pieces of tartan, bear in mind what we've been talking about here, and just put those in context, if you like. A lot of their material up there is from Wilsons of Bannockburn. Here is a piece of Wilson cloth. This is a sample book. It's one of, I think, 7 books or collections of samples of Wilson's cloth. So these books were not produced by Wilson's. They were produced by the likes of Ramsay and Patterson or the Clan Tartan warehouse in Killin, something like that. And what they would do is they would get samples from Wilson's and then they would have them bound and use them much in the way as you would find a tweed sample book at a draper's or a wallpaper book or something like that. They were there for people to choose the most popular patterns of the day. This book is probably 1830, 1840, and you can see it's being sold or offered as Murray of Tullibardine. There are a number of others. So here, this book, again, the same period, but it's being offered as Tullibardine and Dunmore, obviously because of the links into the Earls of Dunmore. And this one, which is just called Tullibardine. So 3 pieces, all woven by Wilsons of Bannockburn, all about 1830, 1840. And if you look at them, you can see they're all slightly different sizes of pattern, again, which shows that there was no standardization. They wove different sizes of pattern depending on the intended end use. I mentioned Lord Dunmore in connection with the Smith's 1850 book. This is the Countess, roughly about 1840, 1845, and she again is quite clearly using Murray of Tullibardine. So it's showing that the family at the time were using this as, if you like, a family tartan. So we've got again that strong link. Cast your mind back to the portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. We certainly see with absolute certainty that the family have been using it by this time for the best part of 70 years that we can demonstrate, and possibly earlier. Lovely waistcoat on the right there. That's in the Met Museum in Chicago, New York. But it's a waistcoat, again, about 1850, 1860. Nothing to do with the Murrays per se, but just shows that the pattern was a popular fashion tartan at the time. Interesting because it's such a large pattern that in order to cut and match it as it has been, there's potentially quite a lot of wastage in a garment like this. But obviously, for whatever reason, it was a popular fashion tartan at the time. And that really brings us right up to modern day. We have here, obviously, Stormont, Lord and Lady Mansfield, he wearing Murray of Tullibardine through that side of the family, and indeed she is as well. Their son, who is the current, is he the Earl Marquis of Tullibardine, but wearing it in, again, colours not dissimilar to those earlier ones we saw, not dissimilar to the ones we saw in the curtains. And finally, hiding slightly, but you've got the three Murrays of Abercairnie, the 3 brothers, William, Bill, and Johnny again wearing Murray of Tullibardine. The other 2 are Athol Highlanders, which is why they're wearing Murray of Athol, I think. But again, just showing the use amongst local Murray families, all of whom have a strong Jacobite connection historically, who tend to and still continue to use the Tullibardine version in preference to the more usual Murray of Athol. So it's just a nice continuation of that. So then in summary, what have we learned? What have we looked at? Murray of Tullibardine is a tartan that we can date, because of that portrait of the unknown lady, to the mid-18th century with certainty. we can see that it's used or was used in a number of Scottish portraits of both Hanoverian and Jacobite sitters. So there was, if you like, it was the go-to tartan, perhaps because it had a lot of red in it. So it was being used as something that showed your status or wealth. It's been associated with the Murrays for a long period. So as I say, I can, not knowing with certainty who that unknown sitter was, but by the time of Reynolds' portrait and the Earl of Dunmore in 1770, so we know certainly for the last 200 and something years it's been associated with the Murrays for certainty. It was a popular fashion tartan during the Victorian period and continues through to today. It's offered widely as a choice for Clan Murray members, but interestingly is still used as, if you like, as the go-to or default tartan for many of the local Murray families around here in Perthshire who have a hereditary or a tradition, family tradition of supporting the Jacobite cause. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my talk, but I'm very happy, first of all, to give the column back to Stephen and then to take any questions.